Right, welcome everyone to Pub's only December meeting. Under Portland City Code and state law, the Portland Utility Board is holding this meeting electronically. Board members and relevant city staff are attending remotely, electronically, or by phone. And the city has made it available for the public to listen to the audio broadcast of this meeting. The public will have an opportunity to provide comment during the public comment portion of the agenda. You can also provide written testimony to the board by emailing utilityboard@portlandoregon.gov. Pub believes and acts upon anti-racist principles. In our meeting spaces and interactions with Pub, while every person has the right to share their personal perspective, we stand against wrongful conduct, particularly any conduct that is targeted towards people that have been made vulnerable by systemic inequities. And this means stepping up as a community when there is wrongful conduct and fostering a space of learning and growth. And the way that we do this is we are active and deliberate. We speak up and we speak out. Each of us is empowered to maintain the culture of the Portland Utility Board, and we will remain focused on the impacted individuals or populations, condemning the conduct, not the person.
Hi, my name is Amy Archer Masters, and I'll quickly run through the meeting guidelines. Please state your name before you speak, and if appropriate, who you're addressing, or just that you're addressing the group. The chat box is only viewable by Pub staff, myself, and Jonna Lynn. So please limit any chats to technical and logistical issues, including signing up for public comment, asking for technical assistance, or reminding us if you've had your hand raised and have been waiting to speak. The raise hand function is primarily used by the board during conversation. We may lower your hand once you begin speaking just to maintain the flow of the conversation. During public comment periods, the public can also raise your hand and you'll be called on when appropriate. If you're connecting by phone, you may need to press *9 to raise your hand. Videos can be turned on when speaking if desired. It is certainly not required. Please mute your microphone when you're not speaking, and if connecting by phone, you may need to press *6 to mute and unmute yourself. Public comment, as mentioned, will be taken early in the meeting during public comment period. You can sign up through chat with myself or Jonna Lynn. It's also available just prior to any formal board vote after a motion has been made and seconded by board members. This meeting is being recorded. I'll pass it back to you, Robin.
All right, so the agenda today is we are going to have a utility bureau's budget develop overview by Cecilia Hoon and Farshad Aladadi. And that will likely take up about an hour of our time today. And then we are going to spend a little bit of our meeting just discussing the upcoming chair nominations, as well as any upcoming meeting plans and announcements. So at this time, Pub members, are there any disclosures of communications? All right, I'm not seeing any hand raises or anyone jumping to speak, so we can move on to the next portion. This is the public comment portion. Amy, has anyone submitted written testimony beforehand?
I've not received anything in writing in advance, and so far nobody signed up through chat. So if you're in the room and wish to speak, please unmute yourself or raise your hand.
All right, not seeing any hand raises. We can move on to the next portion of our meeting. All right, so Pub members, right now we're just going to take a moment to review the November 21st Pub meeting minutes. If there are any suggestions or corrections, please go ahead and speak to them now. All right, not hearing any calls for changes or corrections. The minutes are accepted and approved. All right, so pub members, today's meeting is dedicated to hearing from the utility bureaus to understand background information at the utilities as they're developing their upcoming year's budgets for fiscal year 2025 to 2026. So please welcome Farshad Aladadi from the Bureau of Environmental Services and Cecilia Hoon from the Portland Water Bureau to share their perspectives.
Morning, Pub. For the record, my name is Farshad Aladadi. I'm the Business Services Group Manager at BES. And I am joined by Cecilia Hoon, who is the Portland Water Bureau's Finance Director. And I won the lottery. I'm going to be the principal presenter today, but we do have Cecilia and others available should questions come up. But it's my pleasure this morning to walk you through a briefing of the budget process and some of the background information dealing with many of the financial situations and constraints that our two utility bureaus and the city as a whole are working through this year. So
yeah, sorry, Farshad, I just want to make sure that I am sharing the presentation. Okay, good.
I see.
Let me know when you're ready to advance.
I'll go to the next slide, please. Thanks, Cecilia. So I think it's really important to understand that both bureaus' budgeting work covers two sides of the financial equation, the revenue side in our rate setting efforts, and then the expense side in our budgeting work. They are closely related, and our rate setting profiles that you see here reflect the long-term planning horizon that both bureaus engage in. We're looking out into the future and understanding what are going to be the spending obligations that we have to make, and we calculate the level of rate increase that is needed to generate the revenue to cover those expenses. So our financial planning teams look at both sides, both spending side and revenue side, when we do our planning work and when we budget. This slide shows the individual average single-family home rates for both water and sewer and stormwater, and what the combined rate is for our customer. Last year, we published, and we call these our rate profiles, and they're typically a rolling 5-year look ahead at what we're expecting to need rate increases to be to cover our future budget obligations. And you see here that the combined rate for both bureaus was calculated to be 6.24%. That was before the mayor's guidance this year, which in his initial guidance memo, the mayor limited the level of increase that we could come to council to request by 5%. So we are both bureaus are building a budget around reduced levels of revenue. And subsequently reduced levels of spending, because we won't have the revenue there. So this slide shows the exact impact of the mayor's guidance. Water Bureau's experience will need to reduce their revenue projections by about $1 million from what we previously forecasted. And similarly, BES will be reducing its revenue expectations by $1 million. So this is creating essentially for both bureaus respectively, $1 million budget gap that we need to adjust our spending levels to. And this is some work that both bureaus have been coordinating through the DCA's office to generate proposals that would successfully meet that budget guidance. Next slide. A little bit about the budget overview process. It seems like every year is a new process, and this year is consistent with that experience, both because the change in form of government and the executive function that overlays bureau operations really requires some additional steps and additional budget coordination. But also through the last several years, there have been some hiccups in the budget process that we're trying to learn from and as a city and redesign. And so here's a snapshot of what that budget process looks like. This was developed by the City Budget Office, or CBO. And there are a couple of key points that I want to call out. First, that we're trying to balance our budget to revenues at the front end instead of scrambling to balance things on the back end. That's going to be an imperfect process, but there's been already a tremendous amount of coordination within the public works service area and between all of the service areas around our budgeting, with the goal of raising awareness and filing responding to the city's shared financial constraints in a coordinated way. So there has been some really positive outcomes so far, even though it's been a new process and the change management around this process has been difficult. Some things to call out here: that we are developing a budget, not just for the Bureau, but as part of a larger service area budget. That budget is being, obviously is being led by Priya Dhanapal, our DCA, and that will be submitted as part of the city's overall recommendation to the mayor, which will get uploaded later in January. I think January 24th is the date. The initial budget submittal has to be uploaded. So we're in a bit of a crunch period right now to have the first round of our budget approved for advancement by the mayor. Then that opens up, as is normal, a series of work sessions in the spring where we get to discuss what we're proposing in our budget and how we're responding to our revenue situation, and make any last minute reconciliation with what we call ad packages. So new spending requirements that may be coming at the direction of the mayor or city council that the bureaus have to accommodate. That happens after we submit on the 24th. So there will be some further iterations to what we budget in the early part of calendar year 25. And then the council adopts the budget later in the spring. The budget needs to be approved, I think, because of approval requirements. I think it's no later than June 1, so that we can have the filing deadline met. So next slide on the budget. Yeah. We're right now, obviously, towards the end of December, and I mentioned the January 24th deadline. We're expecting to have community engagement workshops and council work sessions in the March-April timeframe. And we are also expecting to have our rate hearings, which are an important part of our budget process, starting in April. So there are, we're orienting towards a number of public hearings around both the revenue side and the expense side in the spring, and we're preparing to have greater engagement with pub and council during that season as we finalize our budget submittal in the next month. Next slide. I know that there are some new board members on pub, and I think it's important to understand that we have to file a balanced budget. So there are two sides to a balanced budget. There's the expense side and revenue side. The things that we set our revenues to are to cover our operating costs. That's our day-to-day operational expenses. And then a significant part for both bureaus is our CIP, or capital program. And a large portion of our capital program is financed through bond sales. So about a third of our overall budget goes to paying off those loans in the form of debt service. So the annual payment of principal and interest on those bonds is a significant part of our budget. On the BES side, we also have some additional requirements specific to our obligations to pay for, to plan and pay for environmental remediation work. So those are the general categories of expenditures that both bureaus have, and we set rates based on those expenditures. So our principal revenue stream comes from rate revenue, which exceeds 90% of all revenue sources. The other sources of revenue are wholesale fees. These are charges that we make against providing services to neighboring jurisdictions. So because of the geography and historic agreements between local governments, we provide services, both water and sewer and stormwater services, to neighboring communities in exchange for fees through interagency, intergovernmental agreements, and which is a modest revenue source. And then there are some other fees and charges related to development work, both in the specific to sewer and stormwater systems, and then also SDCs, so new property development. And there is a little bit of revenue that we also receive in the form of interest revenue. There are also revenue side obligations in terms of bonds, so that's borrowing. It does provide cash flow, but we have to obviously pay back those bonds with interest. And then at times we do receive some level of support from the general fund and non-rate revenue in the form of grants from external sources. So the expense side and the revenue side always have to balance when we submit our budget. And whenever we have any constraints on the revenue side, that requires us to reduce our spending to fit within those revenue constraints. And I should have mentioned this earlier, Cecilia, of course, if I'm skipping anything or misstating anything, please trim me up. Next slide. I think this is a really important piece, and it shows a little bit of a distinction between the two bureaus. On the left side, you'll see the distribution of our the previous slide of revenue sources, just the proportionality of that for both BES and water. You see that overall our stormwater and sanitary rates on the BES side represent the vast majority of all of our revenue sources, and water sales similarly represent the vast majority of all revenue sources for water. We do what we do largely because of regulatory requirements and permit requirements, and this is a callback to some previous slides we've made to council, the alphabet soup of regulatory constraints you see here. And I apologize, some of these I I can't remember all of what they spell out for, but you get a sense of this interlocking system of regulatory requirements that the Bureau both bureaus have to abide with. These impact both how we do our work and what work we do, both on a capital perspective and an operating perspective. Those permit requirements constrain some of our financial choices, direct some of our financial choices, and is a principal driver for the utilities work. And we don't have control in the short term over these constraints. Over the long term, through permit renewals, we have an opportunity to clarify and renegotiate and do adaptive management on how we meet our permit requirements. But in the short term, these requirements are fixed. These are also regulatory requirements change over time. A good example that many of you, I'm sure, are tracking are some of the forever chemicals like PFAS may lead to future regulatory requirements, which will have explicit cost pressure for the bureaus, both in terms of how we treat our water and how we dispose of any waste relative to the treatment of our water, and how we clean up the environment relative to those constraints. So this is just an illustration of what's driving our work, and gives you a sense of how complicated those drivers are. Next slide. This is a really important slide. I glossed over what the total value of both budgets are, but last year I want to call out that the combined the total budgets for both bureaus were over 700 million each, respectively. And that seems like a massive amount of money, and it is. And when we think about making changes to the budget, specifically reductions to the budget, it seems like there's plenty of opportunity to do that. But there's some nuance there that I want to clarify. And many of our expenditures are required. We don't actually have much flexibility to change our spending levels. And the orange portions of both of these pie charts indicate where we have more discretion to make adjustments. And those are largely in our personnel services, so our salary expense, and external materials and services. So this is these are the charges that the budgeted amounts for things like materials and consulting services that we utilize to do our work effectively. When we have to make budget reductions, those are the zones of our budget where those reductions happen. So a $1 million reduction, for example, as indicated by the mayor's guidance this year, for BES, isn't $1 million. We're not finding $1 million on a base of a $700 million budget. We're finding that we're going to need to make that $1 million reduction from the 150 approximate level of budget that's in those orange zones. So anytime we have to make reductions, it's focused in a narrow part of our business, and it just makes those reductions more painful. Next slide. So I'll hand this over to Cecilia to talk about some of the budget reductions that have been made already, and how that's preparing us for this year.
Yes, thanks, Farshad. And I want to sort of emphasize that while between personnel services or salary for our staffing and even just materials and services for water was 25 million roughly. Finding $1 million feels like a task that probably isn't significant, at least from a percentage position. So what we want to do is, essentially remind council, and pub, that we have been in this budget reduction mode for a number of years. And what we have been doing is basically holding our budget the same and not allowing for inflation internally as a way to help absorb those reductions over the last few years. And, let's recognize that there has been increase to cost. Inflation has been more than 3%, that we went through years where it's 7 and 8%. So we're essentially having to cut and being able to do the same. And some of the other costs that we have actually are increasing at even a greater rate of inflation. Chemical, we're finding in double digits. And I think through the pandemic, they were like going up 20+% in that expense area. Electricity, PGE, we're experiencing double digits over the last couple of years. And a number of these other things that we have been absorbing for the most part, not increasing our budget. And then last year, as part of the mayor's guidance, we also cut 1.1 million out of the external material and services. And I think the other thing that I want to stress is that the budget that we have for materials and services is really executing the programs that we have in place. And so by cutting them, essentially allows us not having the tools to do the work that we need. So, we are essentially, we have been sort of cutting around the edges, if you want to call it that, by trimming as much as we can. And what we have done by not increasing inflation, we have continued to trim around the edges. And I think we're at a point where, any reductions, and when we're talking about even $1 million, cutting really essentially requires us to be looking at staffing. And any more cuts in addition to $1 million is also looking at program reductions. So that is something that we are starting to look at to be able to meet the mayor's budget guidance, to be able to absorb the additional costs that we are still experiencing through the city's transition and having a new council. And then, of course, again, there's these expenses that are even increasing above inflation. So I will pass it back to Farshad to maybe talk about some of their prior year reductions.
Thanks, Cecilia. And your comments reminded me that I skipped a point that has been discussed a lot in recent press releases and some information that's come out from the mayor's office and from the CBO in the past several weeks that many of you are probably already familiar with, but I think it helps to just bring it back up. Both bureaus, and this is true for the city as well. We have positive revenue growth. The situation, our financial situation, is not one of revenues declining. The situation that is really challenging is, even though we have positive revenue growth, the cost of delivering the services that we've committed to deliver are significantly outpacing that revenue or exceeding the revenue. So even though we're in a really good financial position from a revenue perspective, it's just becoming more and more expensive to provide the services to our community than it has been. Cecilia mentioned there's kind of the consumer inflation number, which a lot of people kind of put their thumb in the air and say it's about 3%, but the type of work we do is not related to the cost of groceries or other household expenses. It's industrial grade expenses, materials and chemicals and professional services. Those costs are the inflationary rates are far exceeding kind of standard consumer inflation metrics. So I know that a lot of folks are hearing in the media, inflation is moderate or it's coming in check. And I think that's true perhaps from a consumer perspective, but from our operations, from a utility and industrial frame, those costs are increasing at a faster clip than kind of normal household expenses. So that's the headline for our current financial situation is revenues are positively growing, but costs are exceeding those revenues. And so we have to, as we mentioned, file a balanced budget, and to do that is by reducing our expenditures. BES has reduced those expenditures as water has pretty steadily over the last several budget years. We have absorbed inflationary costs for some of our process expenses. The electricity it takes to run our plants has become more expensive. The chemicals that we use to treat our waste have become more expensive. We've been trying to live within our means as much as possible. And as we have new critical needs for staffing, we're looking first to our current staff and seeing how we can redeploy those positions to the current highest needs. That means that we're reducing service areas on the teams that are losing resources. These are all not totally visible when we're talking about a budget level. These are kind of operational and managerial decisions that we're making in order to prioritize our expenses so that we're doing the most critical work first. We're also using a risk-based methodology to defer expenses, both on the operating side and on the project side within our CIP. And we're making significant reductions generally to our levels of expenditures. In fact, in our last fall bump, we reduced the Bureau's overall budget by $4.2 million. And this was for very important expenditures, but we had to be kind of steely-eyed about where to make reductions. And we made reductions. There were no great answers, but we picked the best of the worst situation to make those reductions. We're also having conversations within the city around the integration and collaboration between bureaus and what the cost sharing is, trying to recalibrate our service levels that we provide other bureaus and other bureaus provide us in a way that prioritizes the most critical work and in an effort to reduce costs for us and for other bureaus. So this is an ongoing, has been an ongoing effort, as it has been for water, and we're in deep with it right now for the current budget development. Next slide. So we have generally shared budget priorities between the two utilities. Our prime drivers are meeting our regulatory requirements. Those requirements aren't arbitrary. They're there for the health of our community and our environment, and dictate how we spend our there's a lot of indications on how we spend our money that these regulations provide. And in fact, some of our major spending in the last couple decades, and water's experiencing this right now, are driven by regulatory requirements. So massive capital investment in response to regulatory requirements. And that when you increase capital investment, you're increasing borrowing, which increases debt service, which increases your budget. So it's there's a strong connection there to regulation. We're also very focused on how we serve our communities and our customers in particular. You've heard a lot recently about some of the customer-facing innovations that we're bringing. We're trying to improve our customer experience, levels of service for our customers, both in terms of just transactional and financial perspectives, but also in terms of disruptions of service. That continues to be one of our principal priorities. To do that, we need to invest in ongoing maintenance of our assets. Many of our assets are near or at end of life and require a higher level of day-to-day O&M costs. And that continues to be our priorities, to find adequate funding for those maintenance expenses. Some new expenses that we know will yield dividends in the near future are the prioritization of us working together between water, BES, and PBOT within the public works service area to start streamlining and coordinating work, making sure that we are in a coordinated way, our priorities are aligned and our spending are aligned, and seeing if we can't realize some financial benefits and operational benefits from that coordination. That's taking, rightly so, taking a lot of our attention in the last 6 months, and will continue to be a priority for both bureaus. And I mentioned reallocating resources as a form of doing our best to live within our means. That's true for both bureaus. We are deferring spending, and so to free up resources to put to higher priority needs internally. That will continue to be the tact that both bureaus take, is to try and minimize our expenditures by rebalancing our budgets towards our emerging priorities before we go to council to request for new resources. Next slide. We've touched on a couple of these already, but cost increases are the main financial issue that we're dealing with here. Those costs are lingering effects of COVID and kind of persistent inflation. There are also some economic impacts related to staffing and pipeline of staffing that when we don't have available people to hire, we tend to rely on overtime, which is a major cost driver for both bureaus. So some of these conditions are outside of our control, though we do have programs to make sure that we have the future workforce ready to meet our needs. We aren't in control of that exclusively. Mentioned the aging of our infrastructure. That's a major driver for our CIP programs, is to replace failing assets. When you replace a failing asset, you are reducing the O&M costs of servicing that old asset, and you do that by targeted CIP investment. So until we get those new assets built and in service, our O&M teams have a lot of work on their plates, and there's significant backlog because of budget constraints. So we're trying to balance all of that within our O&M teams. We have unexpected expenditures of our related to asset failures that need to be accounted for. We also have unexpected expenditures related to weather events and other disruptions that come up. And these are major cost pressures for us. Extreme weather and the resiliency of our system is an important focus of our operating and capital planning efforts. Spent a lot of time talking about regulatory and permit compliance, so I won't go there. Environmental remediation, I think there are a couple of major efforts, specifically in BES, that have significant costs associated with them that we're managing. Of course, there's also transition costs, and one of the marquee items here is some of the shared services that we are responsible for paying our portion of. That takes the form of general fund overhead costs to our bureau. The Kirby Garage and its replacement are a major driver for increased general fund overhead. Several $100,000 of additional general fund overhead can be attributed specifically to that program of moving out of Kirby Garage and building its replacement. There are also ratepayer impacts to SDC charges. Both water and BES have SDCs that we manage, and we are not at full cost recovery for the efforts to process new development through SDC charges. Cecilia maybe can speak to what water's subsidy is, but right now, on average, BES is only recouping 60% of our direct expenditures supporting development and PP&D through SDCs. So the remaining 40% on average is being subsidized by the ratepayer, and is making ratepayer funds not available for other bureau priorities. So this is a major cost pressure. And it's one of those things where we're trying to not stand in the way of affordable development, but also making sure that we're appropriately charging for the costs of that development, and that the ratepayer isn't subsidizing that. I don't know if you have anything that you want to add to that, Cecilia.
Yeah, and so I want to say a couple of years ago, as an example, we were asked to not increase our SDC rate. And when that happens, essentially we're falling behind from what Farshad had mentioned as far as being at cost of service. And as we continue to do that, we just fall further and further behind, which basically means that, you know, what we're not collecting in SDCs, we have to make up that revenue elsewhere. And for the most part, it would come from, you know, the increase in our utility rates. So kind of going back to the very beginning where we had the slide about Rate 101, it's not just the cost of operating, maintaining our system that could drive increase to rates. But if as other revenues is reduced, we're having to make that up through increase in rates, assuming again, you know, the cost remains the same. So our options are, as we have other revenues reducing, we have to either reduce our cost to balance, or we have to increase rates. So at some point, you know, there's that again, that teeter-totter at the bottom where we're trying to balance our resources to the expenses. And yeah, when our expenses are fixed, for the most part, 95% of our system cost is fixed because we have to do the work that we need to be doing to comply with all the regulations. We want to be able to provide the service to our community. You know, the rates is really sort of important as far as balancing that resource to the requirements that we have on an annual basis.
Great point, Cecilia. Thank you. The last bullet on this is a major cost driver for the city, not just the utility bureaus. And I'm going to expand this. This is talking specifically about health benefit costs that the city has negotiated with our insurers. It's expected to increase by, at a minimum, I think we're initially thinking it was, correct me if I'm wrong, Cecilia, I think it was 8%, but it's there are indications that those costs may go up much higher than that and be perhaps cost increases in the double digits.
Yeah.
And this is a class of costs, labor costs, other labor costs you may be tracking, Hub members, is the currently we're in negotiations with 3 labor unions. There may be some personnel costs that increase as a result of the outcome of those negotiations too. So those are these looming cost pressures. We're calling them known unknowns. We know that they're cost pressures. We just don't know exactly what the financial impact is going to be until there's resolution. So we're tracking them as kind of budget or forecast risks that will likely have to be accommodated at a level higher than what we were originally planning. So these combined hopefully give you a sense of all of the pressures that the utility bureaus are facing. And these are all negative pressures. They're going to require us, if we are not able to increase our revenue, either through rate increases or other means, will require us to look at our spending and make reductions to our spending to accommodate these external pressures. And as Cecilia mentioned, we've been making, both bureaus have been making reductions over the last couple of years. Our opportunities to reduce our focus, if you call back to those orange sections of the pie chart, and we've been making reductions pretty steadily for the last several years. There's really nowhere else to go except reductions that will impact service levels profoundly. We may have to look at programs that the communities enjoy and rely on for reduction. And those reductions may impact positions, whether those are filled positions or vacant positions. we have to see the magnitude of reductions we'll have to take as utility bureaus. But that's what's left on the table for us. And that's a very similar story to other general fund bureaus, though our financial dynamics are different. There's not a lot of opportunity to have pain-free reductions at this point for any organization in this city. So it's a pretty difficult place to be right now. But we wanted to share these with you so you have a full sense of it of what we're facing as we're trying to plan for next fiscal year. Next slide. So that was a whirlwind of what we're facing as a utility level or as a utility bureau and kind of some of the choices that we have. We're both actively trying to finalize our budget developments. We have been working with the DCA, the DCAs collectively to share packages that might achieve the mayor's initial guidance. There's been some back and forth as the DCAs have provided the Bureau's feedback, and we've made some adjustments to what our reduction packages are. But I think we're very close on what those look like. And then there are these known unknowns that are only going to become known, actually quantified later in the fiscal year. So in the new year and in the spring, interagencies and other external cost pressures for the Bureau we'll start to have some resolution on that and understand the true budget gap. And in addition, there may be some additional budget packages that the mayor or the new council would like the Bureau to spend money on, which will also add to that pressure and we'll have to accommodate. So there's a lot of information yet to be received that we need to budget for. But right now, I think we're preparing to meet the mayor's guidance on the 24th of January. And I see some hands, but before any closing remarks, Cecilia, before we start taking some questions?
No, thank you.
Okay. Hi, Lorraine.
Hi, Farshad. Hi, Cecilia. Lorraine Wilson, PUB board member. So, Farshad, on the slide showing the rates, the combined rates, I didn't mark it right. There is a dip for BES in year 2027, 2029, 2027, 28, 28, 29. What's the story behind that?
That's a great question. Our philosophy for rate setting is to have stable and consistent and predictable rate increases. We feel that minimizes the financial impacts to our customers.
Mm-hmm.
This 5.15% plateau that we're at is essential for the Bureau, the funding of the Bureau's CIP, as we and some key operational obligations that we know are going.
Could you spell out CIP?
Capital Improvement Program. So
Okay.
This is where we plan in 5 and 10 year chunks what our capital expenditures are going to be, and because we are finalizing some major capital investments in this window, and our borrowing is going to be at a peak. We need to have additional rates revenue to offset that additional borrowing costs. There are some additional operating obligations around environmental remediation that are also keeping our need to have rate revenue at a increased level for the next couple of years. Once those obligations have been met, our intention is to seek lower levels of rate increases because we won't have those new obligations. So this is this is an indication of how we are trying to keep our rates as affordable as possible while meeting these non-negotiable obligations. And you see the timing of this is it corresponds to changes in our our capital expenditures and other core operational work that we will be rolling off in the next 3 to 4 years.
And that is factoring in all those pressures that you just mentioned in not too long ago, all those other known and unknown factors, and inflation and all those things, chemical cost increased, deferred maintenance, consulting fee, all those things, healthcare, staff salaries, etc., etc.
The short answer is no. The short answer is this rate profile was set coming up on 2 years ago. And many of these costs, at that time, we felt that this rate profile was adequate to cover what those known inflationary drivers were. Things have worsened. And we are being asked to keep our rate profile steady and in fact reduce our rate of increase this year. And so the short answer is no. The level of rate increase that we were forecasting and that we're proposing is not adequate to cover all those costs. And that is exactly why we're having to go through this difficult process of expenditure reduction, is to fit into the revenues that will be allowed to increase.
So this will be revised at some point in time. This projected.
This is a dialogue between the DCAs and the city administrator and council. Affordability is a very strong priority for both the bureaus and the mayor and council, and so we're going to have to continue that dialogue and try and find a way to strike a balance between what the bureaus are obligated to fund, what the bureau's expectations are from the community, and what it's going to cost to deliver on that. And something has got to give. Either revenue needs to be allowed to float to raise to the levels of those more expensive levels of service, or changing expectations are going to be necessary so that we can live within the revenue that we are able to generate.
Okay, should I go through with all my questions, or should I have a question with regard to slide 10? I think that's where the priorities for the Water Bureau.
I'll defer to the chair on how to facilitate questions.
I don't know. I'm moving ahead. Slide 10.
Okay.
Water Bureau's priorities. I saw one of the things, budget reductions priority. I see one of the main things included in that is community engagement. What does that look like? I'm concerned about it, since there is already the perception, and in some cases reality, that community is excluded from conversations. Also, I'll just run through my questions. Slide, I think it's the next slide, 11, which is the environmental services priority. Farshad, you mentioned critical work, and can you give a better definition of what that is? And then staffing was one of the things you all said, that there's a challenge with getting the right staff. And I remember it was sometime this year or last year, I don't trust where I think it was last budget period, where Water Bureau had proposed a program that never got implemented. Actually, it was squashed. And one of the purpose, if I remember correctly, was to address that. And you said also absorbed, that you all are absorbing costs. And I need to understand that a little better when you say that you all absorb costs, because it seems that there are a lot of pressures on the revenue that is currently, that the money that's available. And I'm kind of curious about where and how this absorption takes place. And I will leave it at that for now.
So I'll start with Lauren, your question around community engagement. What we're describing here is we have done budget reductions, but we've also added have added cost. And the added cost actually in this area is the community engagement. It was important for us to do more in community engagement. So we have put in more focus in that area that we have essentially absorbed. And to Farshad's, I'm going to use his words, living within our means. We have reallocated within our existing budget to be able to do more community engagement. So that's actually an increase in that effort, not a reduction.
And Lorraine, I'll respond to the absorbed question. I may have missed the question about I think the word that is in my head is critical capital projects. I can't remember what the critical maybe was, but as you remind me of that, I just want to talk about how we're absorbing costs. We're doing that through an internal administrative process. So there are budgeted expenditures that that we're not making so that we can generate some internal budget savings to pay for some of these unexpected costs of non-negotiable expenses. Like we need chemicals to process wastewater, and those chemicals are increasing in cost annually double digits. We're having to defer expenditures that were budgeted so that we have free up resources to pay for these unexpected increases. Similarly, this reallocating staff, when we have an emergent need, staff need in a part of the organization that need was not budgeted, we have the latitude to reclassify a position to do different work in a different part of the organization as an alternative to requesting a new position. That does, on average, let's just say that that's a revenue neutral choice, but it's not an operationally, it does have an operational impact. The team that is losing that resource now has a diminished capability and can't provide the level of service that it was budgeted to provide. So while living within our means or absorbing these costs may sound like a kind of a clean way of managing, it's not without impact. And some of those impacts, given the last several fiscal years of budget reduction, a lot of those impacts are severely impacting the levels of service that we can provide. Kyle, I saw your hand up and then go down. Is that?
No, so I believe Karen had her hand raised as well, but thank you, Farshad. This is just a general question, really recognizing the reality that many of the choices ahead are painful to meet the mayor's budgetary directive. Is there, in our capacity as a board, in support and collaboration with the decisions you have ahead, are there specific moments in time or feedback that we can provide ahead of the January 24th submission or the public utility rate reviews, just ways that we can help support your decision making?
I'll speak from the BES perspective. It may be similar to Cecilia, any comments that Cecilia has. I think there's two things, and I hate saying this, but the development process has been very accelerated, and there's been new process steps that have come along with new requirements that have just made it very complicated for us even to get our heads around what's being required of us from a budgetary perspective, let alone work with the pub and engage on priorities. I will say that that engagement before the 24th of January is likely to be limited to sharing how each bureau is going to meet the mayor's guidance of what packages of spending reduction are we going to propose to meet $1 million of revenue reduction. I think that those are going to be largely, and from BES's perspective in particular, largely non-controversial, that you may have less concern about that, because I think $1 million for us at this point, the first tier reduction is largely going to be focused on projected underspending in areas that we can make up that difference. Where I think PUB's engagement is going to be most impactful is later in the budget process. You know, it could be, right now we know we have to make $1 million of budget reductions respectively in our two bureaus, but it could be that the actual budget gap will be several $1 million. And those cost drivers that were shared are all material and significant. And I think will require it may be overblown language, but may require some existential choices for some parts of our bureaus. And I think while we're considering what those are, I think that's where PUB's engagement would be most critical. Between now and the 24th, these are going to be painful reductions, but I think, you know, if we have, for example, in BES, we have a contract for a change management consultant that we know we're going to underspend by a couple $100,000. I'm not sure that PUB really, that's going to rise to PUB's level of interest. But if we have to reduce a program and perhaps that has a staff impact, that's where your engagement, I think, is going to be most valuable. And that's not going to happen until the new year. And I think we can work with Amy to figure out what are the most appropriate points of leverage to engage PUB with, and when those might fall on the calendar. But it's likely not between now and January 24th.
Understood. Thank you, Farshad. And also just on a general note, clarity and cogency to your team in this acute period and then in the longer term. And if, however, well, thank you very much. Thank you, Farshad.
You bet. Melanie.
Hello, let me turn my camera on real quick. My name is Mally. Thank you for this presentation. I have a few questions. I'm looking at the 2023-2024 budget. And, you know, just for perspective, moving on to this new budget cycle on the PUB website. First of all, I was just wondering if there are expected to be fund transfers for the same in this next fiscal year period, because it seems like a good base amount for this past fiscal year was fund transfers for revenues.
I'll let Cecilia take this one.
You referenced that you were looking at the budget for the current year. I want to make sure that I'm understanding what you're referencing.
Yeah, so I guess I should take a step back. So I'm looking at, you know, we have all these CIP projects and all of these different projects going on. I see that we had a WIFIA loan approved. So looking at using like loans and bonds that, you know, requires a larger payback down the line instead of looking at a grant-based system. So my question is really focused on, now that we're in this like constrained budget cycle, we have like projects in the future that may possibly not be, you know, funded or may need to be cut. My questions are we still going to be proceeding on like a loan basis using, you know, loans and bonds different from like, you know, federal or state level, or is there going to be a push to do more of like more grant administration? Because there are, you know, different grants that are available at the federal level. I don't know if they're going to be around with this new administration for much longer, but my question is more of like our funding that we get from outside of revenue. seems to come from bonds mostly. And I just kind of wanted to see if there's like if that's the same perspective, you know, at the bureaus. Are we still going to be proceeding with that in the future?
Yeah, I mean, you know, what we try to do is really leverage the tools that we have. And those tools are essentially revenues and, you know, the items that are listed on the screen, which are the resources, the revenues that we get. Bonds issuing, that's basically borrowing to do the work that we need to. General fund, we get very little general fund dollars because we're an enterprise fund. We're self-supported through our rates, fees, and charges. And then one area of non-rate revenue is grants. And we are looking at that. And I know BES have a staff person that is looking at, you know, grant opportunities. We also have somebody that's always looking out for grant opportunities. Unfortunately, as we are looking into a lot of those grant opportunities, a lot of them we don't qualify. There are requirements and eligibility where we just don't meet to get those grants. But
Okay.
that doesn't mean that we're not continuing to look. So they are out there and we are continuing to look and find as many of those. You know, $1 million of grant is $1 million that we're saving, but we don't have to be recovering through revenues, right? So those are the things that we are doing. And as far as borrowing, the WIFIA loan is one of those where we seeked because it does provide low borrowing cost for us. And it also helps with affordability as far as, you know, when the payback is happening, that allows us to sort of manage our rates better. So those are all the things that we are continuing to utilize on an ongoing basis, evaluating what is the best tool for us to use. Bonds can only be used to fund our capital work. So as our operating expenses grows because of, you know, all the items that we talked about, chemicals, electricity, personnel costs, they have to be funded with revenues. We can't use bonds to fund those. So there's a balancing there in itself that we have to be doing to make sure that, you know, we have the right resources to pay for the type of expenses that we have going on.
Okay, that sounds great. Thank you. I appreciate that. I have a few more questions, if that's okay, if I may ask them. I see that there are a few, like one, I think the term you all use is like cliff projects or like not cliff projects, but just like one-time payment projects for like CIP work. I see like the Mount Tabor Reservoir conversion and then the AMI project. I just was wondering what the status was on specifically the Mount Tabor Reservoir project. Are there going to be funds allocated this next fiscal year towards that, the covering of those reservoirs?
So we have already completed the covering of the reservoirs project. So we've covered Mount Tabor. The Washington Park reservoirs are covered. We now have a Beard Reservoir in that site. The ongoing maintenance of the reservoirs are actually operating cost. So there isn't any more capital work. There
Okay.
is still some capital work at Washington Park to finish the surface of it, to restore it to what it looked like. So that is in our capital plan to be doing over the next few years.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then the AMI project,
Yeah, the AMI project is something that a joint venture with BES. We are working to put in, I'm going to make sure I got my terminology right. It's automated metering infrastructure that allows us to basically have, you know, immediate reads uploaded. We will be implementing a customer portal that will be providing that information live as we get them. And then of course, the real work is really getting the infrastructure in place, getting our meters replaced, getting that, you know, automated system connected to the AMI system itself. So we are starting that, and we expect that project to be continuing over the next 5 years as we go through our system to replace all of the meters. We have over 180,000 meters that we will have to be working through.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you. And then for that AMI project, have the bulk of the costs been budgeted so far? Like, I know
it is in our capital plan, in both of our respective
great.
capital plan, BES and Waters.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate you answering my questions. That's all I have.
Yeah,
Thank you.
of course.
Looks like we have Ryan
Alex.
and then Alexis.
Sorry, were we handing it over to me? I heard my name.
Yes, I'll defer to you. I'll ask.
Okay.
Enough.
Okay, thanks, Lorraine. So Alexis Strife, voting board member, thank you both so much for coming and for giving kind of this update. It's good to hear, even if I know you guys are facing some hard decisions. I'm curious a little bit if you can expand a little bit on what the transition to a new mayor might mean. And I mean, notwithstanding the new form of government, but especially to a new mayor, given the mayor's role in setting budgets for the city. If you can just, I don't want to ask you to, guess wildly about what changes may be, but I'm just curious if you guys are anticipating anything to change with a change of administration on that end. And I was just like trying to do some Googling to see what our mayor-elect has even said about any of this, and I couldn't quickly find anything, but I'm guessing you guys are drinking that much closer than I am. So just curious if you can say a few words about the upcoming transition.
I can share a couple of comments, but I just see Director Uchiyama came on camera. Did you want to jump in on this one, Don, or did you want to let me take a swing?
Yeah, please go first and I'll jump in.
Okay. I will say that one of the themes that I have heard about the mayor-elect is wanting to have some continuity and minimize disruption during the change of government, and the direction to maintain Mayor Wheeler's initial budget guidance memo, I think, is an indication that he did not want to, at this stage, make any significant changes in the direction that he has given to the bureaus in their budget development. But the way that the mayor impacts budget development is really from a policy standpoint. If there are overarching constraints or restrictions that meet or are consistent with his platform or objectives, that could translate to us making some adjustments to how we budget. Some specific things that I'm thinking about that could potentially impact our budget is how the mayor's what the mayor's vision of the houseless response might be for the city, how that might change the costs that the bureaus need to contribute to offsetting. That's an example of how the mayor's policies could, at later stages in the budget process, change the constraints that we have to work within. The council also, you didn't ask about the council, but the council may also have some policy priorities that have a financial context to it that we'll have to respond to. These are typically called ad packages. So after the bureaus submit their budget, there's a round of opportunities for the mayor and council to make adjustments to what's in the budget, and we'll have to respond to that. I can't say specifically what those policies or potential ad packages are. Don, you probably have you're closer to the issue than I think I am.
Oh, no, that was great. Thank you, Farshad. Thank you both, Cecilia and Farshad, for the presentation, and to Pub for all the great questions and dialogue. I always really appreciate all the thoughtfulness that goes into this, and the questions have been great. I just wanted to add, I agree with everything, Farshad, that you offered, and I think what we're really expecting to see is continuity and stability. That has been Mayor-elect Wilson's main message. And what we don't really know yet with council, right? There are 12 people, and how they come together and how they form committees and how they caucus, all of those things we don't really know yet. So the main message has been continuity, stability, but honestly, we don't really know. And what I was going to add is that I actually think that what happens on the administration side is almost has been more impactful than yet we don't yet know what the elected official, the new form of with our elected officials, how that will impact us. But on the administration side, having a city administrator and 6 deputy city administrators and an assistant city administrator, we've seen quite a bit of change this year. Although we previewed it in the prior year, when the DCAs came on board, it really we're never really having conversations about just the BES budget or just BES water budget. It's the public works service area budget, and so having one deputy city administrator who is tracking and guiding all of these very large infrastructure bureaus and putting together one package, one strategy, one overarching direction has I think really changed the process, and also it has just asked us to not be so siloed or so focused on just our own system. We have to include the other pieces of public works. So I think it's been very eye-opening, and we're learning from each other. And so that's within our service area. And then on top of that, then having Mike bring all the bureaus together and being with Jonas heading up the financing team, you have 2 executive leaders who have intimate familiarity with the utilities. And I just think there is a much broader understanding of the overall budget and the context of what the utilities are doing within the overall budget. So I think overall it's been really good. It's been certainly some growing pains and some bumpy parts, but for the most part, I feel like we're having more shared ownership over the entire city budget and a greater understanding of what's happening with the city financially. So what happens yet with the elected officials remains to be seen. But thank you for the question, and I hope that added some useful detail.
Super helpful. Thank you both.
Just want to chime in. We've got about 10 minutes left of our time together. So it might be imperative for Karen to be the last question of today's discussion. Go ahead, Karen.
Actually, I would like, Lorraine had her hand raised, and I'd like Lorraine to go as the last question, because I can submit my questions by email. I would like just a minute for some context to get on the public record, but I'd prefer that Lorraine go first.
Karen, I was deferring to you. That's why I took my hand down. My only question is just to reiterate that as board members, we represent the community. And one of the questions I have is regard to, for instance, when the mayor asks, hey, adjust the whatever, don't raise the rate, don't whatever. I'm not saying that I'm advocating for a rate increase. Are scenarios presented, and is the community informed of, hey, this is what this would look like? Like, for instance, the SDCs. When the request was asked a few years ago, don't raise the SDCs, were scenarios provided. If we don't, here's what's going to happen, and here's how it's going to impact the community later on. Because my concern is, right, there is a whole bunch of deferred maintenance that's sitting out there that is critical to the infrastructure of the city. And I am just as a board member representing the community, I am always for full disclosure. Let the community know, hey, if we don't raise rates, here's what's going to happen. Here's how it's going to impact you. Here's how it's going to cost you more. Here is what will happen if there is some failure in one of the systems. Here are those things. For some reason, I don't feel that is always done well. And that is why every year we keep running into a wall, like literally running into a wall. And I acknowledge that you all are very challenged with the current budget situation, but it just doesn't seem like that information is communicated clearly for the community to understand the impacts of when a request is made from the mayor's office or from wherever it should come.
Thank you, Lorraine. I really appreciate your question and your using the SDC subsidies that both bureaus are essentially required to make as the example. I think the question is, where does that engagement with the community happen? On that specific example, I can give you some information, but I think it's also maybe indicative of the larger limitations of engagement. SDCs are a collaboration, had been with the Bureau of Development Services, and now with the PP&D, and we share our intention or need for increasing those fees and charges at what's called the DRAC, a development, I forget what DRAC stands for, but it's a Development Rate Advisory Committee, something like that. But essentially it's a facilitated work group between city personnel and the development community, so builders, construction organizations, and related folk, to review and comment on our proposed rate increases for SDCs. The other opportunity that we share this kind of decision is through internal briefing meetings with the DCAs and city leadership and the CBO, the City Budget Office, and then ultimately through the budget work sessions, where we talk about specifically the trade-offs that the bureaus have had to make given these constraints and what the community impacts are. So while it may be limited, there are several touch points that do have community engagement in them. And I know that we can broaden that and perhaps do better, but that's what exists right now for the Bureau.
This is Amy, and I'd just like to add to that as well, Lorraine, that the pub has had a voice in those different elements that Farshad mentioned, and the SDCs was a good example, as well as just looking at the projected rates and the guidance to have a lower than projected rate increase and the potential impacts that has on their deferred maintenance and other items that are moving forward. And those are things that PUB has formalized your opinion some of the years to speak out against the direction that it was going, in hopes to possibly change that decision. Ultimately, they still move forward at lower than projected rates, and that those decisions were made. But that is one of PUB's roles and opportunities, is to speak with that community voice and hope that the policymakers, the final budget decision makers, may consider that moving forward. So I would think that that is an important area for PUB to be thinking about, where you want your comment to land, based on the concerns that you've raised in prior years and the direction that it's moving. When you look at that 5-year forecast, that's not the Bureau's forecast of if they, are raising rates in order to achieve everything they want to achieve, or even to maintain current service levels. Those are based on the guidance that has been provided, what's been approved in the prior year. And as we heard this year, despite needing to come in at a lower rate than projected, those future years under current guidance are not allowed to increase to compensate. So that does have an impact internally. And so PUB should be thinking about where you want to land on advice related to that for the new council and for the city administrator.
Thank you.
Karen wanted to give a context setting comment.
I thank you, Karen Williams speaking. I need to not do that because Lorraine stated beautifully and almost word for word what I wanted to say. Thank you, Lorraine. I will, in that case, just reiterate, or I guess say in my own words, my concern is that the affordability, the rate limit, i.e. the reduction that the mayor's guidance proposes is a bit arbitrary and perhaps looks good in the context of achieving affordability, but what is not being conveyed is the true cost of that so-called affordability and whether that is truly making services more affordable for the people who most need that affordability. That context is what's not being conveyed. And my recommendation to us as a pub and to the bureaus is to think about ways to better, more effectively convey the true cost of cost reduction to the public. And as Lorraine beautifully stated, we are the public as pub members, are members of the community. So that can start with us. Thank you.
All right, thank you all. In recognition of the time, I'm going to jump in and just try to get through some brief announcements and items for pub members as we close the meeting and still try to get through it quickly enough that we can end close to time. So thank you, Cecilia, Farshad, Don, everybody who went into preparing that information. That's very helpful. So the one thing that I wanted to make sure that we highlight is, and it won't take a lot of time as a thank you, but I do want to acknowledge that today is the end of Robin's term as chair. It just goes through the end of this month. So this was the last meeting, and I want to just publicly give thanks and appreciation on behalf of everybody, all past and present pub members as well as staff, for the work that you've been doing, particularly since you've been a solo chair when usually we have always had two, and that allows some spreading of the work and some, I guess, partnership. So just want to acknowledge you started initially along with Karen at the end of her term and then have continued solo. And that the part of that, although I'd like to also give some time right at the very end for others to also share their appreciation, is just to flag again, as we've mentioned at recent meetings, that we do need co-chair volunteers. If folks are interested, welcome any volunteers to make themselves known or reach out to me or Jonalyn outside of the meeting so that we can continue that conversation and try to identify who we can work with as we plan for upcoming meetings. I've shared information previously about some of the roles and can do that more directly one-on-one with folks as we move forward. In absence of having volunteers, then staff will just continue to work off of kind of what has been planned so far and taking the information that we hear from pub members in the meetings and planning based off of that. But it is tremendously helpful to make sure that your voices are coming through clearly as we do that planning. So just want to put that back out on the table and hope to hear from some folks. I do also just want to jump to the final announcements and planning for the next meeting. In recognition that some of you have to drop off pretty quickly or may already be dropping. We do have Administrative Review Committee on January 14th and do need a volunteer for that. There's already some cases that we know plan to go to that date. So look at your email for that and future dates and get back to Jonalyn with any that you may be available to volunteer for, but the most immediate is that January 14th meeting that's coming up just after the holidays. I did also want to make folks aware that we did hear back from the 2 alternate pub member appointees, and both are still interested and eager to engage, and will be catching up on this information and working on onboarding. That will go before council because they don't have any more sessions scheduled for the remainder of this month. That will go under the new council, and the first date that's available is January 15th. So that's hopefully where it will land on the agenda, and then it will be official. But in the meantime, we will be working on getting information to those folks. Finally, just want to highlight that the January meetings are really early in the month. They're back-to-back weeks. So we have one on January 7th, one on January 16th. We will plan on hearing back from the bureaus on the 16th because they're continuing to work on their budget development, and that's when additional information will be available for you all to take in and provide some feedback and prepare for the next phases of the budget. So we don't have any clear agenda items planned yet for the January 7th, and I would love to hear from you all for any direct priorities. If it can't happen right now because we're at time, please either just stay on the line at the end of this call or reach out to John, Lynn, or I in the next, well, today or tomorrow. We will both be out of the office next week, and then John and Lynn will be back on the 30th. I will be just connecting by email and won't be back until January. So I think that covered everything that I was trying to squeeze in. Thank you for your patience and letting me go a couple minutes over. Lorraine, go ahead.
I just want to reiterate, and I think I did speak about this at the last meeting. I raised the concern about equity teams going away at the city. And subsequent to that last month meeting, in the news, it indicated that the BS team is now on administrative leave or something like that for the article. So I'm putting it on record that I raise my concern again because I don't know which direction the city is going in, and maybe the pub needs to rethink if we are aligned with where the city is going. And I wanted to put that out there.
Thank you, Lorraine. For the reminder, I do have that on my list and have flagged it for the bureaus as well for future conversations. I'm not sure what the next conversation would be. We haven't had a chance to connect. Of course, we can't speak to any specific personnel related issues, but the broader issue that you raise is an important one. So I hope to have some plan for next steps in the coming future as far as where that conversation should go. All right, if there is nothing else right at this moment, I guess I'll pass it back to Robin to officially close the meeting and just ask folks to, again, reach out to John, Lynn, and I with any follow-up questions that are budget related, recommendations related to agenda items and the meeting plan, and the upcoming topics. And of course, if anybody's interested in volunteering for chair or to facilitate if we don't have a chair to help by facilitating upcoming meetings. Back to you, Robin.
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone for their engagement and participation in this past year. A lot of ups and downs, a lot of new faces, and a couple of losses. So I just want to thank you all for being in community with me. And I'll see you all in 2025. So meeting adjourned.
Thank you for your service, Robin. You're amazing.
Thank you, Robin.
I'll second that. Thanks, everyone. Have a happy new year.